Well, I'm happy to say this is my last presentation. And I'm giving this on behalf of Sarah Gaches, Jason Link, and John Hare. And I just found out that we're not able to use notes anymore, so this should be an interesting presentation. So, title of their presentation is A Risk-Based Approach to Evaluating Northeast U.S. Fish Community Vulnerability to Climate Change. So when we're thinking about drivers of population change, we often, of course, include fishing as one of those pressures. But there's also a whole lot of other pressures that we can be looking at or drivers, such as species interactions, environmental variability, habitat alteration, et cetera, et cetera. But which of these are the most important to include? Because trying to include everything in a single stock assessment can become very challenging. So is there some kind of simple method out there that we could use to try to figure out what drivers we should look at and not? And of course, the answer is yes. Martin and several others have talked about this triage approach that I have up here. That's based on Hobdays et al. 2007. That goes through this process of looking at level 1, 2, and 3 type of assessments. And this is a really great framework to try to go through and identify what do you think are the pressures on the fishery, and then once you've identified pressures that you think are worthwhile to investigate, then you can dive in more closely in these level 2 assessments, burrow down even more, and then do full level more stock assessments, incorporating those different drivers. And so what I'll be talking about today is these level 2 type of assessment. Although I won't be doing a PSA, we will be looking at climate vulnerability. And the reason that we're looking at climate vulnerability is because my co-authors are from the Northeast region in the Atlantic here, and they have sort of a hotspot or hotbed for climate change in their area. So they see this as a major pressure for their fisheries in the coming years. But they wanted to change up the way that most of the PSA analysis or the way that I presented this morning on climate vulnerability is usually done at a individual stock or species level. And what they were trying to do in this analysis was mix it up a little bit and try to show how you can do these level 2 analysis by looking at them at the community level. And in that way, you can actually increase the rapid portion of the assessment. So normally, these level 2 assessments are considered rapid assessments. This was done by a 3-person team in about a month and a half, including some of the methodology development. And so I don't know what you would call this, an extremely fast method or something. But what they were looking at here was a couple of, instead of the species, we got species groups. And so we got both commercially important demersals and non-target demersals, pelagics, non-target pelagics, and then inverts. And the time frame that they're going to be looking at is not 50 or 100 years into the future. They're looking at 5 to 10 years into the future because that's more applicable to the type of management decisions we're used to making. And lastly, within the Northeast region that we're looking at, there's 2 main subregions within that, the Mid-Atlantic Bight and the Gulf of Maine. So we're going to be looking at differences of communities in both of those regions. So the way that we start off with this is we got the exposure factors that we're looking at. Just like I talked about this morning, when we talk about exposure factors, what we're looking at here is relative change compared to some baseline time period rather than general magnitude. And so the time period or baseline that we're looking at here is from 1960 to 1990 as our baseline data. And then we're comparing the most recent 5 years, which was 2006 to 10 for the data they had, to see how things are changing. And for this particular exposure factor, which is looking at stratification, basically what we're looking at here is here's the most recent 5 years. Here is our reference period here. And whenever you see a plus or a minus over here, that means that there was a standard deviation above reference period during this baseline period. And if you see one of these arrows, it means that there was a standard deviation change within the most recent 5 years. And so if you're looking for exposure factors that have a lot of impact, you'll be looking for symbols like this. And whenever they were going through and trying to provide some kind of scoring basis for how do you score these plus and minuses and ups and downs here, so they went through a process trying to identify duration and trend and spatial scale to come up with some probabilities, and I'll go over that in a minute. So this is for the Mid-Atlantic Bight, and this is only 10 of the 15 exposure factors that they were looking at. I couldn't fit them all on the same page. And so for the Mid-Atlantic Bight, it's a pretty variable system. You got both the cold waters coming in from the north and then the warm waters from the Gulf of Mexico stream here coming up, and it's a big convergence area. And so you don't see a whole lot of major differences going on except for sea surface temperature here, and then you got a couple of these other things for bottom temperature, wind stress, and Gulf Stream north wall, whatever that is. And then this is for the Gulf of Maine, and here it's more of a stable system in that you don't expect to see a whole lot of change in water temperatures and things like that. But based on our 5-year analysis here, we do see a lot more change happening here. So we got sea surface temperature and north-south wind stress, and down here stratification being these major impact areas, whereas we got some other exposure factors up here that are also major contributors. So the way that these co-authors went about trying to describe their exposure scores, they used this probability down here. Like I was telling you earlier, they were going through and trying to develop scores for this. They're looking at probability of the impact occurring and then severity. And what you get here is the green dots are for the Gulf of Maine, blue dots are for the Mid-Atlantic Bight, and then there's these purple ones are for the Northeast Shelf in general. And so what you can see here is that the ones that always come up to the top here is surface temperature seems to have the most change compared to our baseline information, whereas things like, let's see here, winter storms, intense storms, and early spring or lower dissolved oxygen tend to fall out on their lower side of their probability scoring. So that was the exposure factors. Now we're going to talk about sensitivity factors. And just like this morning, there's basically two parts to the vulnerability score. There's the climate or exposure factors, and then there's the sensitivity factors that deal with the biological parameters of a species. And so this uses some of the same attributes that I talked about this morning. This is a general scoring system that they have. And the way, I'll just go over this real quick. We're looking for sensitivity attributes. We're looking at things like habitat specificity, sensitivity to temperature, if you know it, their stock size, population growth rates, things like that. And what they did to go through the scoring process is, because we're looking at community level assemblages, is that they would take an indicator or two. I think they always had 2 indicators for each of these or more for each of these community level assemblages here. And they would go through and using just 1 or 2 of these indicators, go through that scoring process for sensitivity attributes and provide these scores here. And so 1 is the lowest score you can get and 4 is the highest. And here's how the numbers broke down for sensitivity. And I'll show you how that all comes back together here in a little bit. All right. So what this slide is showing is, earlier remember I showed you that exposure plot that had probability on the bottom and maybe it was probability and risk. But anyway, that scoring system didn't align very well with the 1 through 4 scoring system that I just showed you with sensitivity attributes. So what the authors did is they went through this standardization. They standardized their data so that they could turn their exposure scores into scores that range from 1 to 4 by multiplying probability by severity and then grouping them into low, moderate, moderate high, or high based on how they came out of the percentage of maximum possible points. So what you have here is the Mid-Atlantic Bight standardized exposure scores that range from 1 to 4. And then here's the Gulf of Maine standardized scores. And in this particular example here, we are looking at the pelagics assemblage. And what the authors did is they wanted to provide a weighting scheme so that depending on what complex you're looking at, you can give weighted scores to different climate exposures. So for pelagics, for example, they have a default weighting system of 2 across the board. And so what a -1 means is that they took away 1 from the default score of 2 to weight it down, and a 1 means they upweighted it. And so here they're giving, for these pelagic species, more weight to surface temperature and thermal habitat, boundary current shift, and salinity. Whereas if you were to maybe look at our demersal species, these weights would probably be flip-flopped. So here's where it all comes back together. We've got our community exposure scores here on the left-hand side, it's 1 to 4, and then we got our community sensitivity scores, 1 to 4 on the bottom. We plot these out, and what you see here in general is that the Gulf of Maine communities are at higher risk than the Mid-Atlantic, and if you remember, that's because there was higher exposure scores in the Gulf of Maine. However, in the Mid-Atlantic, our scores have more sensitivity for groups 5 and 6, which are commercial benthos and non-target benthos stocks, followed by demersals. So in general, some of the conclusions from the study is that fish and inverts in the Northeast are vulnerable to short-term climate variability, especially our shellfish like lobsters and scallops that don't have as much mobility, and then also potentially for our demersal species like our gadoids, cods, and haddocks and things like that. And I think the main point that the authors wanted to say is that these risk assessment processes like this level 2 assessment, they don't always have to be Cadillac versions, or I don't know what the international version of Cadillac is, maybe the Rolls-Royce version of a level 2 assessment. Depending on who your audience is for, or who your audience is, what you're going to be using the analysis for can basically determine how complex your risk assessment needs to be. This one was a pretty bare bones one, but it was done really quickly, and it's still informative for trying to identify where they might want to move in the future with their stock assessment prioritization process and thinking about other indicators they need to be thinking about. And that's all I have.